Good morning. Happy New Year. Good luck with Mercury retrograde. Check the episode description for content and trigger warnings. When I was planning this episode, I planned to talk about Mercury retrograde and astrology, because Mercury went retrograde just a few days ago and will remain in retrograde until January 18th. And that is a common occurrence. It is something that if you pay attention to things like that, you notice the shifts in energy and the changes in how the world works during these times. But it is something that I grew up believing was a lie, that it was made up, that it was fiction. And as I was planning out the episode, I planned to talk about my mother and how she told me that the way that you can remember the difference between astronomy and astrology is that astrology is a lie. And it has an L in it. So L for lie. And as I was delving into that and looking into biblical references to planets and things such as that, it occurred to me that that was not the focus the episode needed to have. Because as we go into a new year, people focus on changes. And you hear all the time, new year, new me. And people make resolutions and people plan to be better or different or whatever. It's the reason that New Year's Eve is my favorite holiday, because it is full of possibilities. It is a death and rebirth. It is one of the few times when something ends and something dies and people don't despair. They look on it with gratitude and celebration and anticipation and hope for what the newness can bring, which is what death is. In a sense, it is the possibility of newness. And not to say that the death of a loved one should be met with joy, but in a metaphorical sense of death, every ending comes before a new beginning. And New Year's Eve is the embodiment of that, and widely celebrated throughout the world. So with that mindset and with that energy, I want to talk about changing your mind, changing your opinion, or simply accepting and becoming who you really are. Because for a very long time, I believed my mother. Astrology is a lie. There's no truth to it. There's no evidence for it. It's just something that people make up who follow Satan. That's what she told me. And I believed her. I had no reason not to believe her. She was my mother. Why would you not? And I look back on my life a lot and I think of that mentality that most children have. Of course I would believe her. She's my mother. Why would I not believe her? Why would my mother lie to me? Why would my mother tell me something that wasn't true? And I don't think that she intentionally told me something that wasn't true. It was simply her belief system. Though her belief system was very narrow-minded and had never examined anything outside of itself. My mother was raised in a Christian home. She was in, I think, first grade when her parents converted to Christianity fully. And I remember her telling me that they got rid of their Christmas tree because they were extremely strict sect of Christianity and believed that any celebration of holidays was a sin. No, they weren't Seventh-day Adventist, if that's what you're wondering, but they did believe that you shouldn't really celebrate holidays. It was a sin because the Bible says not to esteem one day above the other. So birthday celebrations were extremely small. They didn't celebrate Christmas or Thanksgiving or really anything until, according to my mother, her older brother got married and had children, and then there was competition for holidays because his in-laws did celebrate, and so they suddenly started celebrating Thanksgiving and Christmas and all the things like that when they had grandchildren. But my mother grew up not celebrating holidays, and my mother told me on multiple occasions how she never felt good enough. She always felt guilty. She always felt like her mother didn't trust her and thought badly of her. And she said she never wanted us to feel that way. And yet she did. Which makes me really sad in reflection, because everything that she didn't want to do, she did. And I think that there is a good lesson there in examining yourself. And particularly in allowing yourself to be examined from another perspective. Because you can stare in a mirror all day long and you will never know what the back of your head looks like. You will never know what you look like from the side. You will never know what you look like from any other angle. Looking at yourself head on, face to face, is important. But you cannot live in a vacuum, and you cannot examine yourself in a vacuum and have a full picture of the truth. My parents never allowed critique of themselves from any outside sources, which can sometimes be a good thing, to know who you are and to not allow anyone to change your perspective of who you are or alter your self-worth or anything like that. But they absolutely refused to be checked. And anyone who had anything negative or critical to say about them were either cut off or their exposure was limited severely, because they refused to abide criticism. Criticism is important for self-growth. And when I moved out of their house and was trying to make sense of my life and figure out what the truth was and form my own belief system that wasn't something that had just been handed down to me, I intentionally surrounded myself with people who thought differently than me. I found people who were Buddhists, people who were atheists, people who were Hindu and Muslim, and people who just describe themselves as spiritual, and everything that was different from me that I could find, including different denominations of Christianity, which I had not been allowed to associate with in my childhood except on a very minimal basis. I wanted to know how other people thought, and I wanted to challenge myself to see if it made sense or if it didn't. And in my hand-me-down arrogance that I received from my parents, I fully believed that I would hold the same beliefs, more or less, by being around these people, because I did believe, partially, that I was raised with the truth. Just maybe there were a few things here and there that were wrong. And I thought, if this really is the truth, though, if it's unquestionable, if it will stand the test, then it can stand to be tested. Because the truth will hold up to a challenge. And so I wanted to challenge myself to strengthen my faith, because I felt like I had led this extremely sheltered life with no real outside perspective. And I thought, give me some outside perspectives and I'll compare it against the truth that I know. And then I will be even stronger in my faith and stronger in my beliefs, because I will know that when you hold one belief up to the other, mine stands the test. But what happened was, I realized that the perspective I had been given of absolute certainty of truth couldn't hold water. The Bible that I had grown up believing was the absolute truth, the inspired word of God, infallible, unquestionable, without reproach, was in fact very, very unstable, which eventually led me to leave the church, because if the entire thing is based on this book that is not actually a book, it is a compilation of writings, disconnected, separated by hundreds, if not thousands of years, many of unknown origin or questionable origin, compiled together solely by men who had an agenda to create a cohesive document that would solidify a doctrine. Because if you look at the Council of Nicaea, their criteria, they had a criteria of knowing who the author was. Looking at you, Hebrews. They had a criteria of a certain doctrine agreeing. If the doctrine didn't agree, the book was thrown out or the letter was thrown out. It didn't matter if it met the rest of the criteria. The doctrine had to agree. So they really were not creating a document of the writings of the church and the prophets and the priests and the scribes of the Jewish religion into the Christian religion. They just wanted everything to agree with each other. And they threw out anything that didn't. Which is why the church has been able to have this narrative for so long of, well, it all agrees with each other. Well, yeah, because that's how you created it to be. If you put a whole bunch of books together that you know don't contradict each other, or a whole bunch of letters together that you know don't contradict each other, of course they're going to agree. If you throw out everything that is not in agreement, then yeah, you're going to have a book that agrees with each other. It makes no sense. I mean, it's an argument that they set up for themselves. They created this book of agreeing doctrine, and a big part of their argument is that the Bible doesn't contradict itself. Of course it doesn't. You made sure it didn't. And as I looked at this, it became so clear to me that it was not this divinely guided process. It was the man-made creation of a religion. Which is fine if that's what you want to follow and that's what you want to believe. But it doesn't make yours better than anyone else's. It doesn't make yours more valid or more truthful than anyone else's. It is just as valid and just as truthful as any other religion. And I am an omnist. I believe there is validity and truth that can be found in all religions. And Christianity is not an exception. But I don't think that any one is the exact right one. And I don't think that there is evidence to support making that argument for any religion. And that was a really weird place for me to come to after over 30 years of believing with absolute certainty, with almost no doubt in my mind, that Christianity was the true religion. That it was valid, it was the truth, it was unquestionable. Even in my early teens, when I became very rebellious and started questioning my family dynamics and my upbringing and how I was treated and the religion that I followed, I didn't question the religion itself. I remember saying that I would rather go to hell than spend an eternity with a God who wanted the things that my father did done. Because my father justified every single bit of his abuse with the Bible. Every bit of it. He said it was his God-given duty to punish us, to discipline us, and make us into good girls. And so I believed that. I didn't question that statement at the time. And so rather than saying, this seems a little fucked up, maybe you've got the wrong Bible there, Dad, I said, okay, fine. I don't want anything to do with your God then. I hope he throws me in hell. I hope I spend the rest of my life burning with the devil, because that sounds better than spending eternity with a God who tells you to beat me. That was my mentality. I never questioned the belief until I was an adult and out of his house. And once I was at that point, that was when I started surrounding myself with people who thought differently. That was when I started following blogs and social media pages that were a different flavor of Christianity, so that I could figure out what was truth and what was not. What of my upbringing was biblically accurate, And what was just justification for treating me like shit and being horrible parents? And as I was questioning, I ended up leaving the whole thing because it wasn't what I thought it was. It did not stand the test of validity. And I say all that because it's okay to change your mind, especially when confronted with evidence that you're wrong. And that happened to me for multiple things. I obviously raised in the evangelical church. I was raised very right-wing conservative. My parents were not the type who said that Democrats were sinners, they were evil. You couldn't be a Christian and be a Democrat, but they were almost there. They would challenge that specific statement. You can't say that because there's no Democrats or Republicans in the Bible. You can't say that being a Democrat is a sin. However, if you look at their policies and you look at the things they believe and you look at the people, you can't support a Democrat and be a good Christian. So they would say it without saying it. And obviously, my parents always voted Republican. There were a few instances where they would vote Libertarian or Independent or some other third party in very specific races, but it was always very well thought out and explained away. And most of the time they didn't support Libertarians because Libertarians support marijuana use, and that is not supporting sobriety. Libertarians also support gay marriage in some cases, or just the doing away with of marriage, and you can't support that and be a Christian. So, very much Republican. They were Christian nationalists with a Southern flavor, which is just a really nice way of saying they were racist. Because their Christian nationalism stopped at the Mason-Dixon line. They were very much Southern apologists. They were very proudly Confederate. They were very much the South was right kind of mentality. They both said for my entire lives that they loved each other, but if they had found out that the other one was a Yankee or had, Yankee apologist attitudes, they would not have married each other. So that was what I grew up with. And I grew up hearing stories about the Civil War like it had happened, a few years ago. It was so much a big part of my life that it's really weird looking back on it now and realizing that something that happened almost 200 years ago was such a big part of what I was taught and what I was brought up with, and a philosophy that shaped my entire perspective. I mean, it wasn't just, this happened a long time ago, we're moving on. It was very much, this happened and the outcome was wrong. And because the wrong outcome happened, we have to keep holding on to this heritage, and it has to remain in the forefront of your mind. It was almost like a mentality of a nation or a people who had been captured and subjugated. Like, you can't forget what happened. You can't forget who you were. You can't forget who we were as a people. You can't let it go away. And the irony of that is certainly not lost on me now. But they very much believe that the war had nothing to do with slavery. It was all about states' rights. And I grew up hearing these quotes that I can't find anywhere now, ironically. That General Sherman said that if the war had been about slavery, then he would have fought for the South. And different things like that. And there were certainly people on the side of the Union Army who were racist and slaveholders and not good people. I mean, you look at Sherman's march through Georgia, he was, burning and raping and pillaging. It was not an honorable fight by any stretch of the imagination. However, to paint the South as this certainly not racist, peaceful people who just wanted to live their lives is also not accurate. And my mother read me these books, me and my sisters, The Children of Pride and A Georgian at Princeton. Very interesting if you're into history. They were compilations of letters that were exchanged between a family, and it was a family that owned a cotton plantation. The patriarch of the family was, I think, a Presbyterian preacher or Methodist. At any rate, he was an evangelical type preacher, and based on their letters, it would seem that they treated their slaves well, but how well can you determine that from letters back and forth between people who saw nothing wrong with owning people? And those books were used as examples to me. They were set up to me like, well, this was a typical example of what slaves were like in the South. They were treated like family. That was the mentality that I was brought up with. That you couldn't take something like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a work of fiction, and believe that that was a typical way that slaves were treated, because one, it was a work of fiction, and two, it was written by someone who had an agenda. When I started studying the history of slavery in this country, I spent months depressed and crying because I believed what my parents taught me. And I want to throw up when I think back on the arguments that I made that there was nothing wrong with slavery. It disgusts me to think that I ever thought that way. And I think I am not alone in being someone who survived religious trauma, religious abuse, spiritual abuse, and the trauma and emotional abuse of being homeschooled in the way that I was, and indoctrinated, brainwashed, and coming out of that and realizing what a shitty person I was. It's humiliating. It's embarrassing. I look back on myself in my teens and early to mid-20s, and I don't know that person. I would not be friends with that person. I don't like that person. But that person was also not me. That was a clay figure that was formed by someone else with a mask on that I put on myself for survival. And that doesn't make any of it okay. That doesn't make it excusable. That doesn't make anything that I said or any of the people I hurt okay. And I have to live with that every day. What an awful person I was. I cannot undo the things that I did, the things that I said, the people I hurt. I wish I could every day. But all I can do is try to be better now. And it's a really weird place to be in, to look and to be like, yeah, I used to tell people that slavery was totally okay by the Bible, which, granted, there is an argument that can be made there. You can excuse slavery with the Bible, but I think that's just another example of why the Bible shouldn't be used to live your life, to guide policy, or to use in 2023 as a guidebook for how you should treat people. I mean, it's a book that literally says, yeah, it's fine to keep people as property. That in and of itself should make you question how moral it is. But I mean, I was raised pro-life. There was nothing more important than protecting life. That was how I was raised. That's what I believed. And the most vulnerable, the most innocent life is that of a baby in the womb. And you have to wonder how evil people can be to have an abortion, to perform abortions. And I remember hearing anytime there was like an abortion clinic bombing, well, you shouldn't do that. God didn't call us to do that. However, those nurses and doctors and women in there got what was coming to them. God uses evil people to accomplish his will. That's what I grew up with. Don't go bomb an abortion clinic yourself, but don't be sad when it happens. That is such an evil mentality, and I didn't see it at the time. But when all you know is what you've been indoctrinated into, it's hard to see outside of it. And when I started being exposed to people who were pro-choice, people who were my friends who were pro-choice, it chafed a lot. Especially as someone who wanted nothing more than to be a mother. And especially after I had my first miscarriage, it was uncomfortable to hear people talk about babies in the womb as just fetuses and tissue, and hear the arguments for abortion that were nothing that I had been brought up believing were arguments for abortion. Because everything I ever heard was it was just promiscuous women using abortion as birth control, killing their babies to avoid consequences. And in my early 20s, I actually started a nonprofit pro-life organization. We put on a few conferences. I had a newsletter and a blog, and I was interviewed on a few local radio stations, and that is still humiliating to me to think about that I spent so much time and effort and energy and money into promoting the idea that abortion is evil. It is 100% the pro-life community, whether they realize it or not, and I certainly did not realize it at the time. It is 100% a movement that is dedicated to the control of women. I never in my entire time working with the pro-life community heard anyone talk about measures to make sure that men are held accountable for creating babies. I never heard anyone talk about real measures to support women, single mothers who are expecting and have no support. There were, kind of half-assed efforts. There were pregnancy centers that would encourage birth or adoption. There were pregnancy centers that might give away diapers and formula and things like that up to, I think, 6 months. But that was very limited. And they certainly did a good job of patting themselves on the back for how progressive and kind they were in helping these evil, promiscuous women. And every bit of it came with preaching and trying to convert them to Christianity and leaving their promiscuous, slutty ways. There was opposition at every front for any legislative effort to expand WIC or really do anything that would help a single mother, because they got themselves into that problem. It's their responsibility. Essentially, the entire pro-life movement, at its core, is the belief that if you are a woman and you are sexual and you exercise your sexuality outside of marriage, and as a result of that, you become pregnant, then you should be punished. You should keep your baby. You should have no support in raising that child. And the reason that you're alone and you don't have a man to help you is because you were promiscuous. And you don't deserve to have anyone help you. And you deserve to have been left. That is the core belief of it. And that is coming from someone who grew up in that and who very strongly believed everything that was said about it. That is their core belief system. It is not that life is precious. It is not that babies in the womb deserve to be protected. It is not that the consequences of sex is a baby, and if you are a person who has engaged in sex and created a baby, then you should be responsible for it because they only want to apply it to women. It is absolutely a war against female sexuality and an attempt to control women to prevent open female sexuality. I didn't used to believe that. I changed my mind. I changed my mind because I examined the evidence. I don't think I ever really changed who I was. In any real sense. I have always been a person who was committed to the truth. I have always been a person who was committed to love in my best understanding of what it meant to love someone. What I changed was how I demonstrated those things, how I embodied those things, and how I put those things out into the world in my own actions. I've always been a person who wanted to love everyone around me. But what I was taught about love was wrong. So when I learned what love really was, I embodied that instead of the lies. I have always been a person who was committed to speaking and living the truth. When I learned what the truth was, I embodied that. I spoke that. I lived that. It is not that I have become a different person. It is that I learned. And it's okay to change how you show up in the world. Even if people think that you've become a different person. Even if people negatively say, well, you've changed. You're not the same anymore. Even if it loses you friends. Even if it loses you family. Showing up authentically is one of the most important things that you can do. I grew up believing that gay people were going to hell. They were the worst blight on our society that could possibly exist. My mother would become angry and almost physically ill at any mention on the news of anything related to people who weren't straight. And she would go on tirades about how disgusting it was and how those people should just die. And wishing for the end of the world so God would wipe them all out. I grew up hearing that to such an extreme level that even though I took an interest in other girls, women, when I was about 12 years old, I couldn't admit it to myself until 20 years later that I was bi. And when I finally did, it was the most terrifying thing that I've ever done. I was pretty sure that my parents would kill me if they found out. And I'm not convinced that that is still not the case. Which is one of the reasons why my parents don't have my address. They are not safe people. And becoming who you really are when you have buried who you really are for most of your life feels like becoming someone else. It feels like changing who you are. It feels false in a way sometimes. And that's normal. And it's okay to be gentle with yourself through that process. It's okay to let yourself feel the discomfort and let it pass and stay true to yourself. Because at the end of the day, the relationship that really matters is the one you have with yourself. And if you can't look yourself in the mirror, if you can't be alone with your thoughts, if everything that you present to the world is a script that was handed to you from someone else, what's the point? You get one life. Why would you live it on someone else's terms? Why would you live as what someone else wants you to be? It's okay to change your mind. It's okay to change your perspective. It's okay to change how you show up in the world. So long as you're doing it for the right reasons. If you're doing it because it's what you really believe, if you're doing it because of a commitment to truth, a commitment to love, a commitment to authenticity, then you're doing it for the right reasons. Let yourself heal from the spiritual plastic surgery that was done to you. Let yourself be who you really are. I know this was a really heavy episode that covered a lot of heavy topics. What a great way to start out the new year in Mercury retrograde. But I hope it was helpful for someone. I hope that it resonated with you in a good way. And I hope that you will join me for our next episode as we continue to work together on our mosaic in progress.